Hello. I want to talk about the importance and value of understanding philosophical assumptions underlying Chinese intellectual tradition in reading and understanding their philosophical texts and by extension, their culture. Let me start by saying that we generally assume that the way we think, feel, and act in the world is the only way, the universal way that must be the same for everyone, everywhere, at every time. However, there are good reason to doubt, at least question such an assumption. Consider Richard Nisbet. He and his collaborators have presented a series of fascinating studies, which seem to suggest that East Asians may have a very different cognitive styles in comparison to most people in the West. That's you. Westerners, they find, are more field-independent and analytic, they say, in that they tend to focus more on salient objects and their properties in separation from their background, context, and relationship. Westerners also have a preference for using rules about categories in predicting and explaining the behavior of those objects. On the other hand, East Asians, they say, are more field-dependent and holistic in that they tend to focus more on background events and their relationship and use those relationships to predict and to understand the unfolding of events. One such study they cite is by Liang Huangqiu, who showed pictures such as chicken, cows, and grass to Chinese and American children, asking them to group them together and why. He finds that American children tend to group things together in terms of their categories. For example, chickens and cows are animals. On the other hand, East Asians tend to group things together in terms of their relationship. For example, cows eat grass. To give you another interesting example, by Masuda and Nisbet, my favorite one, they presented 8 animated pictures to students attending University of Michigan and to Japanese students going to Kyoto University in Japan. What did American students notice? They noticed the biggest, baddest, and most colorful fish in the tank. But what did Japanese students notice? They noticed rocks, bubbles, plants, and of course, little animals behind. Background events. Of special interest to my fellow student of philosophy here is that different culture with different system of belief may have a profound influence on our philosophical intuitions. Consider this remarkable study by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch. They use one of the most influential thought experiments in Western philosophy, the Gettier Problem. The Gettier Problem questions the traditional definition of knowledge as justified true belief, showing that belief could be justified and true without being an intuitive case of knowledge. When they presented Gettier cases to American students and European students, they pretty much shared the intuition. But when they showed them to East Asian and South Asian students, interestingly enough, the responses were generally reversed. Going back to Nisbet, to account for the apparent difference between our cognitive styles, he and his collaborators went back to ancient Greece, they went back to ancient China, to their respective systems of thoughts, metaphysics, epistemology, social organization practices, and so on. I think this is right. I generally agree with this direction. I suggest that there's a genuine cash value in spelling out what philosophers Roger Ames and David Hall refers to as the uncommon assumption, or those philosophical assumptions undergirding the Chinese intellectual tradition. Many scholars, East and West, that's including Hall and Ames, they often look into the Book of Changes to scout for such an assumption. This actually makes sense because one of his commentary, the appended remarks, appended statements, is considered to be one of the most important sources for understanding Chinese cosmologies. Other scholars, such as the great historian David Kinley, goes even further back to Song Dynasty divination practices and their metaphysics 3,000 years ago. However, scholars have also warned against making any kind of sweeping generalizations about China. Why? China is simply too vast, too complicated to be reduced to a set of simple propositions. But philosopher Roger Ames, with full awareness of the complexity involved, and he's fully aware of the provisional nature of any such generalization we can make about China, he nevertheless maintains that what is more dangerous than us making responsible generalization about China is our failure to make them. He even goes on to suggest, he calls for the need for every student of Chinese philosophy to be sensitized, he says, to those ambient assumptions that made the Chinese philosophical tradition the tradition that it is. Why? because such sensitivity, if you will help us locate Chinese philosophical texts in their own distinctive intellectual landscape that is meaningfully different from our own. And more importantly, such sensitivity will help us avoid the aforementioned assumption of universality, which often license a kind of uncritical or even unconscious projection or importation of our own assumptions, frameworks, even agendas into our reading of those texts. Let me give you an example. Consider the philosopher Tang Junyi, who is one of the most important contemporary Chinese philosophers. He has derived what he calls distinctive features of Chinese philosophy from the Book of Changes. Let me share two of them here. There's actually quite a few. He argues that the concept of fixed substances and fatalism or determinism are largely missing from the tradition. That is, the Book of Changes and its appended remarks portrays a kind of processual worldview wherein all things are in a perpetual state of change and transformation. Things, from this perspective, are not individual discrete substances that are independent from each other. Rather, they are interdependent events and processes that are constituted by every other. This is a world of interweaving processual events that largely precludes any kind of appeal to some external metaphysical entity as a cause and explanation for their being, even better for their becomings. Now, consider the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the central Taoist texts, with over 150 translations in English alone. Its first line is probably the most famous line in Chinese philosophy. Without me telling you what the line says, please consider the following translation. If we were to assume that we pretty much believe about the same thing, then this translation, this interpretation could make sense. However, if you were to be sensitized to some of the distinctive features, even two I share here, then it will allow you to ask some questions. Were the author or authors really talking about the God as the everlasting infinite first cause, or even as the creator? Even when presented with a better translation, we could still ask questions. Were the authors really talking about something enduring and completely unchanging, in the same way that you and I might understand the terms? Or were they talking about something not fixed, something not determined, something that's transforming, but in a special way that is informed by their own distinctive, uncommon assumptions? I, therefore, side and agree with those interpreters and translators in recommending the importance and value of spelling out those philosophical assumptions, presuppositions, distinctive features, however incomplete and imperfect they might be, to use them as a functional interpretive context in understanding and reading Chinese philosophical texts, and by extension, China. Thank you.